All right, buckle up for a deep dive today. We've got some fascinating sources about the life of Jesus, and surprisingly, some stuff about Pete Hegseth.
The current Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, the one and only.
Well, it's not every day we get to connect ancient history with modern politics. Should be interesting.
Definitely. So we've got these clips from Following the Messiah, which it was actually filmed in Israel.
Oh, wow. On location.
Yeah, exactly. Then we'll jump to some videos and articles about Pete Hegseth and what he's doing over at the Department of Defense.
An odd pairing, maybe? But I have a feeling we'll find some connections.
Yeah, I think you're right. So let's start with this, Following the Messiah. It takes us to Bethlehem, Jerusalem, Nazareth, all the places Jesus actually lived.
Wow. Like it's a time machine, right? Back to first century Palestine. You can really get a sense of what life was like back then.
Absolutely. One of the first places they take us is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem.
Oh, I've heard it's beautiful.
It is really ornate. But then, you go right from this grand church down into a cave underneath.
A cave.
Yeah. They believe that's the actual spot where Jesus was born.
Huh. We always think of like a stable, a wooden barn kind of thing.
Right. Christmas cards and all that.
Exactly. But a cave, that's really different.
Yeah. And, back then, caves were used for privacy, for seclusion. It actually makes more sense historically.
Makes you think about the whole Christmas story in a new light.
Doesn't it? And the documentary, it doesn't shy away from the difficult stuff either. They show these burial chambers near the cave with the remains of infants.
Oh, wow. Victims of King Herod, probably.
Yeah. The massacre of the innocents. It's
Yeah.
a chilling reminder of just how dangerous things were back then.
Even for a baby.
Exactly. From Bethlehem, they take us to this hillside outside the town where shepherds would have been watching their flocks.
Right. The shepherds. The first to hear about Jesus' birth.
Yeah. And they emphasize how important the shepherds were. They weren't just these isolated figures. They were actually skilled messengers, constantly communicating with each other.
So they were the perfect people to spread the news.
Exactly. They were like the ancient world's town criers, almost.
I like that.
All right. So next we're in Jerusalem at the southern wall of the Temple Mount.
Wow. What's it like?
You can still walk on the ancient Herodian street. It's incredible, those massive stone pavers.
Wow. So Jesus and his family would have walked on that very same street.
It's mind-blowing, right? And then those huge steps leading up to the Temple Mount.
I've seen pictures. They're enormous.
They are. Imagine the crowds, all those people going up to the temple for the religious festivals.
It must have been an incredible sight.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then we meet these two people, Simeon and Anna, really devout individuals. They meet Jesus at his dedication in the temple.
His dedication.
Yeah. When they brought him to the temple as a baby.
Right, of course.
And Simeon and Anna, they recognize him as the Messiah right then and there.
Wow. That's powerful. It foreshadows, everything that's to come.
Yeah. So then the documentary takes us north to Nazareth.
Jesus' hometown.
Exactly. And they've built this replica of a first century village there. You can see homes, workshops, even a replica tomb. It's amazing.
Wow. So you can actually get a feel for what daily life was like.
You really can. And it's so different from modern Nazareth. Back then, it was this quiet, peaceful village, very secluded.
So different from the bustling city it is today.
Completely. They take us inside a carpenter shop. Imagine Jesus, as a young boy learning his trade from his father.
That's a great way to put it. He wasn't just some divine being. He was a real person.
Right. With a real family and a real job.
Yeah. And they also show the village synagogue, right?
They do. And that's where they tell the story of Jesus when he was 12.
Oh, yeah. The story where he's left behind in Jerusalem after Passover.
That's the one. His parents find him in the temple having these deep theological discussions with the teachers.
Even at 12, he was already, challenging the status quo.
Yeah. It's really a glimpse into his understanding of his mission, even at that young age.
And then the documentary takes us back to Jerusalem. To the marketplace this time.
Oh, yeah. The marketplace in the old city. It's a totally different scene.
I bet. Bustling, crowded.
Oh, yeah. And the sights and smells and sounds, just incredible.
A total sensory overload.
It is. It makes you think about how different things are now.
Like going to the grocery store. It's so sterile and organized.
Exactly. No live chickens running around.
Yeah.
But back then, you'd have families buying animals for sacrifice at the temple.
Right. Like Jesus' family. It really brings those stories to life, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And then we're back at the southern wall again. And they ask us to imagine Mary and Joseph realizing that Jesus is missing.
Oh, wow. That must have been terrifying.
Imagine searching for your child in that massive crowd. The panic, the fear.
And then the relief when they find him.
Yeah. You can almost feel it, right? It really drives home the human element of the story.
It does. So far, this deep dive is giving us a really powerful picture of the world Jesus lived in.
Yeah. It's amazing how these historical and cultural details can enrich our understanding of, well, everything.
It's like seeing it all through new eyes.
It is. All right, so we just finished our journey through first century Palestine with Jesus.
A fascinating journey.
It was, and now we're fast-forwarding a couple thousand years to Pete Hegseth.
Our current Secretary of Defense. Quite a jump.
It is.
Yeah.
But as we look at Hegseth's approach at the Pentagon, I think you'll see it's unique, to say the least.
Yes. Maybe even a bit controversial.
Yeah. Hegseth's definitely made some bold moves since taking office.
Oh, absolutely. He came in ready to shake things up, that's for sure. He wanted to rebuild what he called the warrior ethos and modernize things, make sure resources were being used the right way.
One of the first things he did was announce some pretty big budget cuts.
Right. He went after what he called woke Biden-era non-lethal programs.
Which basically meant?
Well, things like diversity and inclusion initiatives, DEI, and climate change programs.
And those cuts, they drew a lot of criticism. People argued that those programs were, really important.
They said they were crucial for building a more inclusive military, one that's, ready for anything.
Hegseth's counter-argument was that these programs were distracting from the military's main mission.
Warfighting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He said the money could be better spent elsewhere, like modernizing weapons and bolstering combat readiness.
And to help him figure out where to cut, he brought in, well, this is interesting, he brought in DOGE employees.
DOGE, like the self-driving car company.
That's the one. They're also known for their aggressive cost cutting.
Yeah.
And their data-driven approach to solving problems.
So Hegseth thought they could find some waste within the Pentagon.
Exactly. Streamline things, get rid of unnecessary spending, instead of relying on the usual military consultants.
So he brings in a tech company. It's pretty unconventional.
Oh, it was definitely a bold move. And, there were concerns.
Like what?
Well, some people worried about conflicts of interest, especially with Elon Musk involved in so many different things.
Right. It's like, should a private company, especially one with ties to other industries, have that much influence in the Department of Defense?
That was the question a lot of people were asking.
So besides the budget cuts, Hegseth also put a freeze on hiring.
And he ordered a review of all probationary employees.
It sounds like he really wanted to, I guess, clean house.
In a way. He wanted to make sure everyone was on board with his vision, the warrior ethos. He wanted people who were fully committed.
But that must have caused a lot of anxiety among Pentagon employees.
Oh, yeah. It was a tense time. Some people saw it as a way to get rid of anyone who, didn't agree with Hegseth. Others worried it would, make people afraid to speak up.
Like stifle dissent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Create a culture of fear.
And then there's Hegseth's stance on the Russia-Ukraine war. That was a whole other controversy.
That's a big one. He refused to condemn Putin directly.
Instead,
He kept saying we need to negotiate peace, which was, well, it was very different from the previous administration.
which had been much more supportive of Ukraine
Yeah,
and much more critical of Russia.
definitely. And because of that, some people accused Hegseth of, well, appeasing Putin, abandoning Ukraine
Hegseth said that wasn't it at all. He said his goal was to end the fighting.
to achieve a lasting peace. He thought blaming each other would only make things worse.
He also said that President Trump was the best person to negotiate with Putin, that he could, actually end the war.
That's an interesting point, because Trump's relationship with Putin, well, it was complicated.
Some people said it was too friendly.
Right. But Hegseth seemed to think that Trump's willingness to talk to Putin, even when others wouldn't, was a good thing, a sign of strength. He thought it could lead to a breakthrough.
It's clear that Hegseth isn't afraid to take risks. He likes to challenge the way things are done. But, his decisions have created a lot of controversy.
They have.
Yeah.
And I think it's because he represents a real shift in how the U.S. thinks about defense. He's all about military strength, and he's not so sure about international alliances. And, of course, he's very aligned with Trump's agenda. It's a big change from how things have been done for decades.
And speaking of shaking things up, Hegseth also oversaw a big change in military leadership,
Oh, right. He replaced several high-ranking officers.
with people who were seen as more in line with Trump's
It
views.
was a huge deal. Usually these kinds of changes are done very carefully, with support from both parties. But Hegseth moved quickly, and he often bypassed the usual procedures.
Yeah, it sounds like he just went for it.
He did. And it definitely sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Some people were happy to see the old guard go. They thought it was time for new blood. But others were worried. They thought it would make the military too political.
Like it would undermine its independence.
Exactly. And Senator Reid, you remember him.
Yeah, he served in the military, right?
He did, and he's on the Armed Services Committee. He was very vocal about his concerns.
What does he say?
He said he thought Hegseth was putting loyalty to Trump above everything else. Above experience, above competence.
So he thought it was more about politics than about choosing the best people for the job.
Right. He said Hegseth was sending a bad message to military leaders that your career depends on who you support politically, not on how good you are at your job.
But Hegseth defended his actions. He said the president has the right to choose his own team, his own national security team.
He said he needed people who could carry out Trump's vision.
But some people weren't buying it. They thought he was just putting his own people in place.
And his commitment to streamlining the Pentagon, well, it also showed up in his decision to replace the JAGs,
Jags.
Judge Advocate Generals. They're the top legal advisors in the military.
Oh, okay.
Some legal experts saw this as a way to weaken the rule of law within the military.
Really?
They thought it could lead to, actions that might be considered illegal.
That's, it's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. The JAGs are supposed to make sure everything's done legally and ethically.
Yeah.
Even if it means, disagreeing with the president.
So they're like a check on power.
Exactly. But Hegseth said he just wanted to make sure the JAGs were giving good advice that was in line with the Constitution. He thought the old way of choosing them was too closed off.
Too insular.
Yeah. He said he wanted to open it up to more people, get some fresh perspectives,
Right.
make sure the advice was aligned with his vision.
But critics thought it was more about installing people who would agree with him.
Yeah. They thought he was trying to surround himself with yes men.
So replacing those senior officers and then going after the JAGs, it really made people worry about civilian control of the military.
It's a fundamental principle in our democracy.
Ah.
The military has to answer to civilian authority.
And Hegseth kept saying he was all about transparency and accountability, but some of his actions didn't really seem to match that.
Right. Critics said he was actually consolidating power and aligning the military more and more with Trump's political agenda.
So what we have is a picture of Pete Hegseth as a bold leader, decisive, but also someone whose decisions have caused a lot of controversy and raised some serious questions about, the future of the military.
He's definitely doing things his own way.
Yeah.
And whether you agree with him or not, he's definitely left his mark on the Department of Defense.
It's a big contrast from the way things were done before.
A big contrast. Now, the question is, how does all of this relate back to our exploration of Jesus?
Yeah, that's the big question. We started in ancient Palestine, and now we're in the modern Pentagon. It's quite a leap.
It is.
Yeah.
But as we go into the last part of this deep dive, I think you'll see some interesting connections, maybe some surprising ones too.
So we've covered a lot of ground. First century Palestine, Jesus's life, and then boom, Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon. It's how do we even connect these two stories?
It is a challenge. You've got, on one hand, a humble carpenter who becomes the spiritual leader, and then, a modern political figure leading a powerful military. But I think if we look closely, we'll find some interesting parallels and some really stark contrasts, too.
Yeah. One thing that struck me was how both Jesus and Hegseth, they both challenged the powers that be, the establishment.
That's a good point. Jesus challenged the religious authorities. He questioned their hypocrisy, their rigid interpretations of the law.
Sure.
And Hegseth, he came in wanting to shake things up at the Pentagon. He challenged the hierarchy, the bureaucracy.
But their approaches were so different, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. Jesus, his approach was all about humility, love, compassion. Even for his enemies, he was about peace, forgiveness, even when he was facing persecution. And Hegseth, he's all about strength, assertiveness, military might. He's He's not afraid to use force to get what he wants.
It makes you wonder if those two approaches can even, can they exist together? Can you be a peacemaker and a warrior at the same time?
That's a question that's been around for centuries, hasn't it? Can you be strong and compassionate?
Yeah.
It's a tough one. No easy answers.
Oh, another thing I noticed, both Jesus and Hegseth, they both use storytelling.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, Jesus, he was the master of parables, right? Those stories with vivid imagery, relatable situations. And Hegseth, well, with his media background, he definitely knows how to use a good
He
story.
knows how powerful narratives can be.
Right. He uses those historical analogies and he frames events in a way that, well, that supports his
It's
views.
all about how you tell the story, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. But there's a difference in how they use storytelling, I think. Jesus, his parables, they were often meant to challenge people's thinking, make them question things. And Hegseth, his stories, well, they tend to reinforce what people already believe.
Second, one is trying to open minds and the other is trying to solidify existing opinions.
Maybe. And of course, there's the whole thing about faith. It's central to both of their stories.
Absolutely. For Jesus, faith was, well, it was everything. It was about complete trust in God, a willingness to surrender to God's will, and a commitment to serving others, no matter the cost.
And Hegseth, he talks about faith a lot too, but it seems, well, sometimes it feels more like he's using it to, appeal to a certain group of
Right.
voters.
It makes you think about, what does it mean to have faith? When is it genuine, and when is it more about appearances?
And how do you balance faith with power, with ambition? It's complicated.
Very complicated. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm feeling a lot of things inspired, but also a little uneasy.
I know what you mean. It's on the one hand you have Jesus and his message of love and compassion, and then you see how those values can be, well, twisted, maybe used for things that aren't so good.
It's a reminder that we need to be careful. We need to be critical. We need to look beyond the surface, you know, examine the motivations of people in power, whether they're religious leaders or politicians.
And we need to remember what true leadership is all about. It's not about controlling people. It's about service, about humility,
Hmm.
about putting others first.
It's a good reminder for all of us. How are we using our influence? Are we building people up, or are we tearing them down?
That's a good question for all of us to think about.
Well, this has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. We started with ancient history, and somehow we ended up talking about some of the biggest issues we face today.
That's what makes these connections so fascinating. It's about asking questions, challenging what we think we know, and hopefully helping you, the listener, to keep exploring these ideas on your own. So until next time, keep digging deep, keep asking those tough questions, and keep looking for those unexpected connections that make life so interesting.